Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Anna Dunn, an editor here at Connect, and I'd like to thank you guys for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few moments to point out a few features that you guys can use. You can type in your questions for Tyra in the comment box on the left-hand side of your screen. Feel free to submit your questions and comments throughout the session. You can also provide feedback. We love to get your feedback, so you can use the comment box for that as well. A recorded version of this session will be available on demand on our websites. If you have questions about obtaining a certificate of attendance, please contact Haley Panagakis at hpanagakis@connectmeetings.com. I'll share her email again at the end of the session, but let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank Great Wolf Lodge for making today's presentation possible. Here to share some information on the brand is Taryn Rathman. Taryn?
Yes, thank you, Anna, and special thanks to Connect for their partnership and setting us up today as the webinar sponsor. As Anna mentioned, my name is Taryn Rathman, and I'm part of our sales team here at Great Wolf Lodge. For those of you who are not familiar with us or our groups and meetings capabilities, we have 14 locations across North America. At each location, we begin by ensuring our teams are the most responsive in the industry. Add to that configurable meeting space, fully integrated audiovisual, and separate conference center entrances with satellite check-in capabilities. And the result, your meeting will be great. As I mentioned, we have 14 locations, several of which are conveniently located near major metro areas or in some cases established tourism destinations throughout North America. We offer oversized, spacious guest suites with a semi-private sitting and work area, which also includes a mini refrigerator, microwave, and granite countertops throughout, all offering the perfect place to get caught up or to wind down after a long day of meetings. Finally, we here at Great Wolf Lodge believe that our people are our competitive advantage. From the very beginning of the initial planning to the closing remarks, you feel confident knowing you are supported by an entire team of meeting professionals that are fully vested in your success. For more information on Great Wolf Lodge groups and meetings, we ask that you visit our website at greatwolf.com/meetings. That's greatwolf.com/meetings. And thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar.
All right, thank you, Taryn. Now it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Tyra Hilliard. Tyra is a speaker, writer, and coach, as well as a professor of business, hospitality, and event management. She has been honored for her professional achievement as an educator and uses her diverse and unique background to reach learners young and old, from college freshmen to seasoned professionals. Tyra is one of the only people in the world with a law degree, a PhD in hospitality, and a CMP. Her industry experience includes working as an attorney, a meeting planner, a catering manager, and a CVV sales manager. Tyra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you, Taryn, for Great Wolf Lodge's sponsorship. All right. Welcome, everybody. And thank you for attending today. Looking forward to having your participation. So please do type any questions or comments you have in the chat box. Anna and I will both be following those. And I have put a few slides throughout at the end of each sort of major section, so you can ask questions and we'll take time to cover some questions and comments. I am not one of those who has the patience to wait till the end of a presentation to ask questions or answer them. So I figure you're not either. So our session is called The Law of Doing Good Things. And basically, we're going to cover 4 topics. We're going to cover the duty of care, Good Samaritan laws, volunteer liability, and food donation. So let's go ahead and get started on our duty of care. So when we talk about duty of care, I think the easiest way to kind of approach this subject is to think about it in a scenario. So let me paint a picture for you. Let's suppose you're an attendee at a conference. It's held in a hotel and you're an attendee. You're walking down a hallway, taking a break from a session, and you see a fellow attendee slip, fall, and injure himself. Nobody else is around. So my question is, do you render aid? Take a minute and think about that. Okay. Some of you will say, well, of course I render aid. I'm going to help him up, or I'm going to make sure he's okay. But some of you may pause for just a minute and go, I don't know if I'm going to help. And it's okay if you've paused, because especially if you've ever worked in a hotel, you've probably been taught to pause, because you've probably been taught to think about the liability risk. What if I help him and I hurt him worse? And you're right. Sometimes I do tell you why not. Stephanie, you're absolutely right about that. Why you might not want to help, or why you might not help, is the liability risk. My next question would be, do you have an obligation to help him? Well, as an attendee at a conference, no. You have no obligation to help him. You're just a passerby. But what if you're the meeting organizer? Or what if you're a hotel employee? Any of you out there who work for hotels, I know you have a protocol for if somebody gets injured in the hotel. And it's probably call security, make sure they bring their incident report form, and offer to call 911 or an ambulance, and you have a whole protocol that goes with. If you're a meeting organizer and it's your attendee, I would think you'd want to help. But again, you've probably got that little nagging liability issue in the back of your mind, and rightly so. Because, if somebody does get hurt and you were there and you helped or didn't help, and they sue, as people are prone to do, unfortunately, especially in this country, the first thing the judge is going to ask is, do you have a duty? Did you have a duty to help that person? And there are legal tests and there are laws that govern whether you have a duty and at what point that duty is fulfilled. Liability is found if there is a duty, if that duty of care exists, if the duty is breached, and if the breach is the proximate cause. That's just a legal term for the breach is the cause of an injury or the aggravation of an injury. So, for example, our person slips and falls, you help him up. In helping him up, you aggravate an injury, a rotor cuff injury he had in his shoulder already. Well, now you've made a bad problem worse. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of these lawsuits come from. It's not the fall that injured me. It was this person negligently helping me up, which is a terrible, terrible thing if you ask me. But that's, again, the way our legal system works. Another example, again, just try to envision this. If you saw someone drowning, what would you do? I mean, we'd all, again, like to think that we're going to jump right into the water and we're going to help. But what if you're not a very strong swimmer but nobody else is around? Are you going to endanger your own life to jump in and rescue somebody? Or what if you were there, but you're going to have to leave your child unattended to jump in and save somebody, putting your child in danger, which is in itself illegal and depending on the circumstances. So there's almost always a scenario we can come up with where we're not going to act. In some cases, that's okay. In some cases, it's not. Prosser wrote this very, very famous text on torts or on negligence. Every law student has to read it. And this is a very famous quote from that very famous book. The expert swimmer with a boat and rope at hand who sees another drowning before his eyes is not required to do anything at all about it, but may sit on the dock, smoke his cigarette, and watch the man drown. Now, that's a very, although poetic, depressing way of saying, basically, in general, unless you have an affirmative duty to act, you don't have to act. You don't have to do anything, because that's the way the law in the United States anyway, and in most of our states, works. So if you choose to help, that's great. But the law doesn't say in general that you have to help, unless, for example, there are some affirmative duty relationships. For example, a parent has an affirmative duty to their child. You have to help your child. You have to keep your child safe. There's also in loco parentis, like a teacher or a babysitter who is there, in place of the parent, has a duty to that child. A travel industry personnel, like flight attendants, have a duty. And a spouse, you have a duty to your spouse, unless nobody's looking and they have a really big life insurance policy. And if you're a trained medical professional and you're acting with an expectation of compensation, you have a duty to act. So think about if you're a meeting planner, it's your meeting and it's your attendee that gets injured. What's your duty? What's your duty of care? I would say you have one, but when and where and how it's fulfilled is going to depend on the specific circumstances of what's happened. And if your meeting and your attendee who's been injured is in a hotel, well, the hotel has a duty to that person as a hotel guest too. So now there's at least two entities with duties, and it's going to come down to who saw what, when, who arrived on site first, who witnessed what. And so this is why it's so important to make sure that you've got a good risk management plan in place, that you've talked this through, that you know what numbers to call for security, that you know where the safety equipment is, all of that kind of thing. Because all of those things, having a risk management plan alone goes to showing the court, if it comes to that, that you have fulfilled your duty, that you are on top of it, you've done your due diligence. So are there any questions or comments about duty of care before we move on to the Good Samaritan Act? This was sort of just to lay the groundwork for kind of the rest of what we're going to talk about today. Anything on duty of care? All right. Let's see. Okay, so Stephanie wants to know if you can get in trouble if you do help. Yes, you can sometimes. You know, as I mentioned, you could aggravate an injury, or in some cases, you know, there have been people that have refused help. And then when you try to help them anyway, because you think, you know, lady, you're bleeding from your head, you know, you don't seem right, you seem a little out of it. You need help and you just don't realize that I'm going to help you against your will. That can then file suit for assault, because you touched them, because you picked them up and you moved them somewhere out of the middle of the floor or the hallway or the road against their will. So yeah, people are kind of crazy that way. I can't imagine why anybody would sue anybody who was trying to help, but there have been cases where, especially if injuries are aggravated. Bonnie asks if it's okay to act. Your instinct says at least offer to help. Yes, I think, you know, certainly a verbal offer to help is great. I mean, nobody can, you know, fault you for saying, do you need help? What can I do for you? Would you like me to call an ambulance? Let me get security for you. In fact, if I were a hotelier and I had a meeting group in house, I would make sure they knew if one of your attendees gets injured, call us. Even if they say they don't need help, even if they say there's nothing wrong, call us, because you sure don't want somebody to have slipped and fell in the hotel and, you know, not have acted on it. So absolutely, I would offer help. It's just, if you go beyond anything verbal, it unfortunately can come back and bite you. And I think that's a shame. Personally, as human beings, I would hope we would err on the human side and not worry as much about the legal side. But I think you have to know the risk you're taking. And that's why I do this session, so that you at least are aware of it. All right, well, let's move on to Good Samaritan. And let's talk about the Good Samaritan laws, because it's because of this crazy, I tried to help somebody and then they sued me, that we've come up with Good Samaritan laws that say if you acted in good faith to try to help somebody, you're not looking for compensation for it, and you didn't cause the accident or injury, you're not liable. You're not going to be liable for you know, again, for doing anything, for, you know, as long as you, again, didn't help them against their will. As long as you didn't, you know, take somebody with a broken leg and drag them by their ankles across the road, you know, which would be gross negligence. Or, you know, again, you didn't run into somebody with your car and then try to render aid because you caused the accident. Then there are Good Samaritan laws. They vary because they're statewide. But they basically say, we're going to make sure to shield you from liability for basic negligence, because we want you to help each other. And so this is a wonderful thing, the Good Samaritan laws. But there are, of course, many things. As I mentioned, one of the issues here is that you have to be doing something not for compensation. And so one of the big issues that comes up is, what do we consider compensation? Now, obviously, cash is compensation. But what about ski passes? A lot of times, like volunteer ski patrol will get ski passes as compensation. Not money, but just free ski passes in exchange for being ski patrol. So does that constitute compensation? What do you think? Because if it is compensation, then they're not covered under Good Samaritan laws. If it's not compensation, then they are covered under Good Samaritan laws. What do you think? Yes? No? I've got a yes. Got a compensation? Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so most people think yes. At least in the state of Colorado, ski passes do not constitute compensation. Now, this is just one state's law, but they say in Colorado, their state law for Good Samaritan specifically says ski passes don't constitute compensation for purposes of applying the Good Samaritan law. So these people, for rendering aid, are still covered by the Good Samaritan Act. And that's a good thing, because you can imagine if they weren't, it'd be hard probably to get people to go and do that job on a volunteer basis. And that's probably why the law exists, because it's better to have people out there doing ski patrol than not. So a lot of times there's this public service reason for that. So here's another example. What if you've got an EMT? There's always that period of time between when somebody's working in the rig, an ambulance, and they get off work, but they're still in uniform. So let's say somebody is riding around an ambulance, they're working, then their shift ends, they park the rig, and they stop at a diner to have lunch, and somebody starts choking. Do they have to render aid? So this is another duty question. Do they have a duty to render aid because they're an EMT, they're trained for it, they're in uniform, but they're off shift? And this is another one of those gray areas. And of course, there's a million of them. But this is one of those situations that has come up in the law several times. And at least some of the cases, and I'm hearing a no, and Elizabeth says she has several colleagues who say yes, they're required to. Lisa says yes if they're in uniform. Zachary says they're still acting as an employee of the paramedics because they're in the vehicle. So yes, if they're in the rig, I would say yes, they're probably still on shift. But if they're just sitting in a diner and they're off shift, the law says, at least in some states, if they are not being compensated, that means they're off shift, they're not being paid, then no, they don't have to render aid. But there certainly may be company policies that say, absolutely, you render aid even when you're off shift. And of course, these laws are going to vary by state. Somebody asked if medical people have a duty even outside of work. No, they don't. Unless they don't have a duty to render aid outside of work. So there can be a doctor on a plane, when somebody gets in trouble and people say, is there a doctor on the plane? Somebody could say, yeah, I'm a doctor, but no, I'm not going to help. So they certainly don't. But if they do render aid, then they are not covered by Good Samaritan laws. So medical professionals, to some extent, fall under a different situation. Somebody asked about a volunteer EMT, and that's a great example. A volunteer EMT, and again, this is going to vary somewhat by state, but most state laws, and I've mostly researched volunteer firefighters, but in most states' laws, a volunteer firefighter, because there is no expectation of compensation, has no duty. So if a volunteer firefighter, for example, can walk up to a burning building, say, this is too dangerous, there's no way I'm going in there, even though there's somebody trapped in there. And because they're not being compensated, they don't have a duty and they don't have to. So there's certainly ethical issues. And again, there may be states where the laws have been written differently or have been modified for public service reasons, because we don't want firefighters to be able to turn away from a fire. We don't want EMT personnel to turn away. But as Leanna mentioned, you could have an EMT driver who stopped at a bar, had a few drinks. That was not her exact comment. I'm embellishing. You may not want them to render aid then. And I'm sure there are plenty of policies and rules against drinking in uniform. But rules are broken now and then. But there's also what we call bad Samaritan laws. And these, I think, are fascinating. And these are laws that are called duty to rescue laws. So where in the United States, we have a lot of laws that say you don't have to rescue. You don't have to help. You don't have to rescue. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Especially in Europe and some other places, they have some laws called duty to rescue laws, where a failure to act may carry even criminal penalties. Now, the laws vary in different countries. In some countries, you have a duty to act if you witness an accident. So there's a car accident, you see it happen, you now have to go help whoever is injured in that car accident. In some countries, you have a duty to act if a witness tells you about the accident. So the car accident happens outside, we're sitting in a restaurant, somebody who witnessed the accident comes in and tells us about the accident. Now we have a duty to actually go and help. And in some countries, you have a duty to act if you know about it, whether or not you witnessed it. So these duty to rescue laws, I personally think, are much more ethical because they do require you to act, which I think is much better. Now, in the U.S., we do have a few states, and Wisconsin is one of them. So with a nod to our sponsor who is in Wisconsin, a few U.S. states have duty to rescue laws. Rhode Island and Vermont have them. In Minnesota, you have a duty to rescue or provide notice to the police. And in Wisconsin, those present at the scene of a crime must either report the incident or assist the crime victim. So you've got several of our states that I think are a little more progressive in that sense. Let's talk about the ramifications of not rescuing, not helping. In Hurricane Sandy, when Hurricane Sandy hit the Northeast in Staten Island, there was a mother and two boys, small boys, 4 and 2. They were trying to get to dry land. The car got stuck in the water, and the mother unbuckled them to get out of the car that was stuck. They got swept away in the water. She yelled and yelled, trying to get somebody to help her get her boys who were being swept away by the water, and the neighbors wouldn't help. Now, some people might say the neighbors shouldn't put themselves in danger to rescue the boys. I get that. But maybe somebody had a life ring. Maybe somebody had life jackets. Maybe somebody had a boat or a float or a something that could help. A famous case that was made into a movie, the Cheryl Rahu case, 21-year-old woman gang raped on a pool table in a very busy bar. Patrons stood by and did nothing. These are the things that happen when we don't act, when we don't help. We had a couple of questions. Anne asked, how do you obtain duty to rescue laws outside of the U.S.? I'm assuming, Anne, you mean if you're holding a meeting in another country and you're wondering about their laws. I think that's where it's helpful to have a DMC over in that, or a PCO over in that country that can help you, or a tourism bureau. But the bottom line is you'd have to just do the research and find out, because as far as I know, there is no place that's a clearinghouse for all of these laws. But I would probably, you could probably start a search, and the way that I do a lot of my research is just Google. It's not any fancy database, and do duty of rescue and the country name and start there, and then go to the government website and search duty to rescue or duty of care. Shannon wants to know, what does the duty to rescue cover? Do you have to physically assist, or is calling the police enough? Most of these laws specify one or the other, and some of them say you either have to physically assist or call the police. So it really depends on the nature of the law. But in many cases, they don't expect you to endanger yourself. And so in many cases, just calling the police or an EMT or firefighters or whoever the appropriate emergency responders would be are the right is all you really need to do. Flossie wants to know, would the status of off-duty or on-duty provide some kind of protection or obligation to the Samaritan? I'm not sure I completely understand your question. Can you expound on that a little bit? And I'll move on and come back to you. So what if instead of our person slipping and falling, our person that injured themselves in a hotel instead had a heart attack? Had a went into sudden cardiac arrest. Think about the same questions. Would you render aid? First of all, that would depend on whether you're CPR trained. And if so, what would you do? Would you help him? And if you did, what would your liability risk be? If you're trained in CPR, if you have access to an automated external defibrillator, an AED, that would make a big difference. But I think that's a little bit touchier situation, because even people who have been trained in CPR sometimes aren't really confident when it comes down to helping somebody who's truly having a heart attack. But just a little PSA here, as many people die from sudden cardiac arrest each year as do from all of these other forms, other ways, including house fires, car accidents. So this is a really big issue. And the reason I mention this is, for those of us in the meetings industry, you gather large numbers of people together, you're going to have some heart attacks. We've got an aging population where, obesity is a problem in our country. All of these factors go to increasing the risk of sudden cardiac arrest. And not having automated external defibrillators is a huge issue, because every minute of delay to defibrillation results in a 7 to 10% decline of survival. So think about it. For those of you, if you're hotels or another facility and you have an AED, think about where that AED is in your building. How quickly can it be gotten to the ballroom, a meeting room, a guest room? Because if it's 2 minutes, great. I still have an 80% chance of living. If it's 10 minutes, I'm probably not too likely to live. And then, keep in mind the survival rates. CPR alone is 9%. 9% of people having sudden cardiac arrest who get CPR, about 9% survive. 22% of those who get a shock delivered by EMS. But bystander AED, that's you or me using an automated external defibrillator, 38% of people live. Why? Because we deliver a shock quicker than the EMS does, because they've got to get from there to here. So there's a real need for these defibrillators. And so meeting planners, and when you're booking a hotel, I hope you'll ask the questions. Do you have AEDs? Who on site is able to use them? Where are they kept? What number do we call if we need one? Some people that I know and who even hold meetings internationally, especially those with an at-risk population, older or up for other reasons, carry an AED. They've gotten their own organization prescription for an AED, and they have figured out what needs to be done in order to travel with one. So that would be something that I certainly would talk to my lawyer about, as far as liability and what all needs to be done. But if that's something that you want to be sure you have one that you may want to do. Now, the good news is there's a Cardiac Arrest Survival Act. This is a federal law that provides Good Samaritan protection to both the users, that's you or me, and the acquirers, that's our organizations we work for, of the AEDs for damages occurring as a result of emergency use of an AED in a public setting, which is great. I love that there's a federal law covering this, but unfortunately, this federal law only applies to any state where there is not a state law, And all 50 states have their own AED law. So that federal law is kind of useless. And unfortunately, the state AED laws vary widely. They are all over the place. So 12 states have a law that protect only AED users who've been trained by a sanctioned organization. New York forbids the use of an AED by anybody untrained. But 39 states and DC protect all AED users, trained, untrained, certified, lapse certification. Illinois only trained users are protected from civil damages, but all entities are protected. So it varies. For my money, wherever I am, I would use the AED if it was there. I would take the risk of liability. This is me as a person, not me as a lawyer. I would use the AED. I would go with this 39 states and DC as the majority, but you could be in New York. You could be in Illinois. And hopefully those laws will change to be better. Now, one of the problems we have in our industry, and I will call it a problem, is that unfortunately our hotels are not on board with having automated external defibrillators in their properties. And many of you hotels know what I'm talking about. Your lawyers have probably come in, and if you've ever asked the question, shouldn't we have AEDs? You've probably gotten your hand slapped by your hotel lawyer. Because most hotels aren't on board. Now, these numbers are from a 2009 Wall Street Journal article, so some of these numbers may have changed. But back then, only 20% of Hyatts had AEDs. Choice Hotels only said they had very few. Intercontinental said they don't require their hotels to have them. Starwood said 13% had medical assistance available, but whether that's a first aid kit or an AED, they didn't specify. I do know that I've had colleagues talk to hotels that said their hotels were forbidden to get an AED. Why? Liability. What if we have an AED and we need it? Somebody's having a sudden cardiac arrest and we go to use it and it's not charged up, or the batteries are dead, or the pads were never replaced. So in other words, what if we're held liable for not maintaining it? Now, again, I would love for there to be a law path that says, if you've used, good efforts to maintain it, just like fire extinguishers. See, this is why I don't know why this is a big deal. We have the same issue with fire extinguishers. They have to be maintained and checked and all of that. John asks a very good question. Why do they seem to be available in most airports? Airports are smarter than we are, I guess. I'm not sure. I think, and I joke, but my guess is it's sort of a risk issue. The risk of losing somebody in an airport versus the risk of liability in an airport, maybe they consider it not as significant. Plus, airports tend to be under a whole different governing law because they're airports. But I imagine that because it's hard to get in and out of airports and it's hard for emergency, it's sometimes far to get to emergency care, like hospitals, or to get an EMT there, and they don't have them on site. My guess is they've decided that it's wiser to have them than not. And there may be, and I do not know this, but there may be laws through the FAA or through some other administrative arm that protects them. I'm not sure. I want you to imagine, and this is the story I tell hotels. This happened at a hotel in San Diego. Stuart Cohen's daughter was getting married at a San Diego hotel of a prominent name that you'd all recognize. And after dancing with his daughter at her wedding, Stuart Cohen collapsed, having a sudden cardiac arrest. He had doctor friends there at the wedding, and they called for an AED, but the hotel didn't have one. So he died there at his daughter's wedding reception. And the family sued, and the court said the hotel was under no obligation to have one. So, again, that's that whole, you don't have a duty. That's not your obligation. That's beyond your duty of care. But it just doesn't seem right to me. It just doesn't feel right. I think the next thing up on the sort of legal docket that is very similar to the AED laws are the EpiPen laws that are starting to come out. This is a sample EpiPen law. There's at least 16 states that have these, according to Tracy Stuckrath with Thrive Meetings and Events. But this is the Georgia law. I'm in Georgia, so I pulled this one. But it says EpiPens can be stocked in public establishments. That would mean hotels and events, potentially, where anaphylaxis may occur. And there's Good Samaritan protection for trained individuals who administer the drug in good faith. So this is kind of like our AEDs. This is something to stock in your emergency equipment. You know, a lot of the anaphylactic shock and allergy reactions are people who didn't know they had an allergy to something. And the great thing about this is, although it says trained individuals, the American Red Cross provides an online training course on how to use the EpiPen for $20. So anybody could go online and take this training and be a trained individual. Now, I would love it if hotels and restaurants in particular had these EpiPens on site, because there's just far too many injuries and risks related to this. All right, are there any other questions? There were some great questions as we went along about the Good Samaritan Act or the duty to rescue laws or AED laws. I hope you planners will start asking your hotels about AEDs. Michelle asked if EpiPens aren't dosed per person. You know, I don't know a lot about EpiPens, Michelle. Tracy Stuckrath is sort of my expert on EpiPens, but my understanding is it gives these EpiPens give out a certain dose of epinephrine, and as far as I know, it's not tailored to a specific person. Or maybe this is a certain dose that's safe for everybody. That's a really good question. I'm going to try to find out the answer to that. Let's see, I'm just looking at some of the other questions. And Michelle, you asked, are there generic ones? You mean generic EpiPens? I mean, there's a lot of people have brands of EpiPens. Oh, and thank you, Dee Dee. I appreciate that. Dee Dee says some EpiPens talk to you during the administration of the drug, just like AEDs do. So, you know, they tell you exactly what to do. Remove the cap, you know, do this. And somebody wanted to know if EpiPens are considered a prescribed medication, if epinephrine is. You know, does anybody know the answer to that question? I mean, I know people need a prescription for their own EpiPens, but the point of this is kind of like it's an emergency dose of medicine if you are close to death. I mean, if your throat closes up, you go into anaphylaxis, it's better to have this dose of medicine than not be able to breathe and die. So I think that's why this law was passed. So yes, it is prescribed. But this is, I guess, a dose they consider worth the risk. But certainly, could they run up against somebody who has an allergy to epinephrine? Probably. And they've probably decided that's just a risk worth taking. So if it's available by prescription, then how would a hotel or planner gain one just in case? Apparently, they've made this available through this law, so that you in fact can. If you're in one of these states, you can actually purchase it as a public establishment, and without as far as I know, without a prescription, or maybe you have to get one. Oh, Gary says they stock them as a hotel. Yay for you, Gary Bruckner from Orlando, Florida. Good for you for the hotel stocking them. I want to know what hotel you're with. All right. Let's move on. Great comments. Gary says they keep them with security. So security administers them, I guess, if need be. All right. Let's move on to volunteer liability. I want to make sure we can get through everything. Let me give you another scenario. And in this scenario, we're going to talk about, let's suppose you have a lot of volunteers. You're doing like a Habitat for Humanity project, and one volunteer shoots another volunteer through the leg with a nail gun. I know everybody just went, ow, that hurts. Think about whether the shooter would be liable for his actions. Think about whether the charitable organization hosting the Habitat for Humanity program would be liable. And how you, if you're the one organizing this volunteer project, might protect your organization from liability. Now, fortunately, there is a law called the Volunteer Protection Act. The good and bad of it is it protects volunteers. It does not protect our organizations. So the Volunteer Protection Act is for volunteers of nonprofit 501c3 organizations, not C6s, so just C3s. Volunteers that are acting within the scope of their responsibilities are not held liable for anything that happens due to ordinary negligence. So if our nail gun shooter just wasn't paying attention to what he did, didn't put the safety on, and accidentally shot that nail, wouldn't be liable because it was just ordinary negligence. So that's the great thing about this. And the reason this law was enacted was that people were starting to not volunteer because they were afraid of liability. What if I do something wrong? What if I injure somebody? What if I drop a board on somebody's head? And so the government said, the nonprofit said, we need volunteers. We can't do what we do. We can't do our good works without volunteers. And the government stepped in and said, okay, well, we'll take away the risk of liability for ordinary negligence in order to try to encourage people to volunteer more. And it worked. So it doesn't protect your organization, but it does protect the volunteers. Now, there are exceptions, as there are for any law, it seems like. The volunteer is not protected if they're doing something outside the scope of their volunteer job description, if they don't have a license or certificate they're required to have, if they're operating a motor vehicle, if they do something willful, criminal, or reckless, that constitutes willful, criminal, or reckless misconduct or gross negligence. So let's say that your volunteer is on site and his job is to carry the boards from point A to point B. Well, he decides he's a little tired of carrying the boards from point A to point B, and he's going to just grab that forklift over there and he's going to drive that. Well, he's not licensed to drive a forklift. So now he's operating a motor vehicle. He doesn't have the license, and it's probably reckless that he's driving this without having any idea how to drive this. Or maybe he's nearsighted and he didn't bring his glasses and he's driving it. So those would be examples of some kinds of exceptions. And then there are the exceptions for the bad volunteer. The bad volunteer is not protected if what they've done is violent or related to terrorism, hate crimes, violations of a civil rights law, a sexual offense, or if they are under the influence of alcohol or drugs. There are some state requirements, and these are all things that would be important to minimize the risk to the organization. Risk management procedures, including mandatory training. Respondeat superior, that means the organization's responsible for volunteer actions just like employee actions. And the organization needs to be insured, because that's how we protect our organizations. We get commercial general liability insurance. We get director and officer liability insurance, which protects our directors and officers, and can also be extended to protect our organization. And we talk to our insurer about coverage for the acts of volunteers. So there are different insurance products. I don't pretend to be an expert in insurance because it's so confusing. Any questions about volunteer liability before we move on to our very last topic of the day, which is going to be food donation? Okay. All right. Let's talk about food donation. And I'll admit I'm a little bit of a bleeding heart on this subject because there is so much food waste and so many food insecure people. So this is a little bit soapbox, a little bit legal, and a little bit just practical. So again, let's sort of start with a scenario in mind. And the picture doesn't exactly match the scenario, but let's say you're a meeting planner and you realize the day before an event or 3 days before an event that your numbers are going to be far below what you've guaranteed. Now, you know the hotel or the caterer or the restaurant, you've already given them the guarantee. You know you're going to pay for the food, but you don't want to just have all this food go to waste. Now, you could, as some planners do, upgrade the food to filet mignon if it hasn't been ordered already, but that close out it probably has. So if you're going to pay for it anyway, you might ask the caterer, the hotel, the restaurant, to give the food to the local homeless shelter or soup kitchen. And unfortunately, we often get the answer, oh, no, we can't do that. We're not equipped to do that. No, we can't do that for liability purposes. Health department won't let us do that. And all of that is not true. They may have a policy that they choose not to do that. And I can, it is a lot of work to do, but it's certainly not against the law to do. And so that's why I wanted to make sure I included this in here, because you can make the case that instead of wasting that food or paying for it and just leaving it for the restaurant to resell to the next group or to other guests, that it get donated. 40% of food, in general, food in the United States goes uneaten. Think about your refrigerator, whatever day you go shopping, think about the end of the week and all the stuff you pull out of your refrigerator and throw away. I don't know about you, but we always have a, half empty thing of hummus and some fruit we didn't quite get to, and, some beets that didn't quite go in the juicer that are starting to look a little awful. And, so there's always that kind of thing that goes uneaten. 20 pounds of food per person per month. And yet 1 in 6 Americans lacks a secure supply of food. It means they're not sure where their next meal's coming from. So reducing food loss just by 15% could feed more than 25 million Americans a year. We talk a lot about world hunger. We've got a lot of hunger here in our own country. Unfortunately, the federal government passed the Bill Emerson Food Donation Act. So planners, I would say, the next time you get a no on this, go to this URL I've provided, or just Google Bill Emerson Food Donation Act and get a copy of the law so you can take it in and say, look, there's no civil or criminal liability for donating apparently fit grocery product in good faith to needy individuals. So sure, we can donate this. So, because that is what the law says, so that means to needy individuals covers homeless shelters, soup kitchens, battered women's shelters, whatever C3 kind of organization that it is. And the only exception is, of course, if there's gross negligence or intentional misconduct. So, obviously, if the food is laced with rat poison, then that's intentional misconduct. Or if you put the food in the trunk of your car, the chicken salad in the trunk of your car, leave it there for half a day, and then take it to the shelter. Yes, that's gross negligence. That's not the way to do it. So that's not the way that you want to do this. You need to do it properly. And that's where I think hotels and restaurants and caterers do have a good point, that it's not their job necessarily to get it from their kitchen to a homeless shelter and that kind of thing. But some of them do. And some of them will just ask you to make the arrangements to have the food picked up in an appropriate vehicle. So usually a refrigerated vehicle or something, that's appropriate, that they can transport it to keep cold food cold and hot food hot. Generally, of course, the best food is food that hasn't been cooked, but can you send cooked food? Yes, you can. Somebody asked if cooked food qualifies as grocery product. Yes. And this law, if you pull up this law, it will define for you what apparently fit means, what grocery product means, what all the terms mean. So this is a law that is a lifesaver. And I think that a lot of suppliers sometimes think that planners don't know about this, or maybe suppliers don't know about it or haven't been told about it. This is an organization that donated Green Meeting Industry Council, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, They donated, they were only a 250 person meeting, and they donated 90 pounds of leftover food. I mean, that's a lot. This is some language that Meet Green came up with for your contracts. And I borrowed it from them because I thought it was good language. And she gave a couple of options here. So for organizations, that say, look, we're just not going to donate it to people. We're too worried about liability. We just can't do it. We refuse. Then you've got the second language is donate at least the table scraps to a local farm or compost. So feed it to the pigs. Compost it. At least it's not just going in the trash. So it is going back into the earth or going back to animals. The first is, of course, to donate it to somebody. So Dee Dee asked if most soup kitchens have the appropriate vehicles for food transportation. Some do, some don't. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, Dee Dee, is finding the food partner. And that's what this is. This slide is for. These are a couple of resources to help you find somebody because, of course, we're holding meetings in a lot of different cities around the country, around the world. At least this will help you with the U.S. Food Donation Connection actually lists different charitable organizations in different cities that you can partner with. And as does the USDA. If you search the USDA site under food donation, it will also have a site. Now, Jim Spellos, who many of you may know, is also coming up with a list. I don't know if most people know Jim as a technology person. Okay, thank you. Lindsay corrected my URL. It's not food donate, it's foodtodonate.com. Thank you, Lindsay. Anyway, Jim Spellos is a technology person, but he is also very big on food donation. And he is coming up with a vetted list of food partners, and it's not done yet. I checked with him because I wanted to put it in here. But it's not done yet, but he is working on one for the meetings industry that he and his partners have actually checked to make sure that they are vetted partners that you can rely on to work with. So that will be coming out soon. And I think that'll be great for you too. This is also something, and Jim also had a hand in this. He's good friends with the people who run Rock and Wrap It Up. If you haven't heard of that organization, you should check them out online too. But this is the Whole Earth Calculator. This is if you do donate food, you can take the number of pounds of food and you can, this Whole Earth Calculator, which you can get online, will actually convert it into number of meals or CO2 or methane. And then you can actually share the results. So because if you're doing food donation, you want to share it. You want to share it with your members, with your employees, in your annual report. I mean, you want to let people know what you're doing, that you're doing good at your meeting, or that your hotel is doing good. So, I think that's, that's important. And these are some great tools that people are starting to come out with. This is through EventMobi that I think that are great for you to use. And John mentioned that at the NACE annual meeting coming up next month in Hollywood, Florida, they're going to be donating unused foods from the meeting and the gala dinner event at the Diplomat. Hey, that's great. Thank you, John, for sharing that. All right. Are there any burning questions about food donation? I know we've covered a lot of different topics, but I hope that this was helpful and this was interesting. Doing good's important, but liability sometimes can be a barrier. So I'm really hoping that this will help people not feel like it's such a barrier. Any questions? Type them into the chat screen if you have any, and I'll answer as many as I can before I turn it back over to Anna. And Anna, I know somebody asked if the slides would be available, and I know this is being recorded. So maybe you can mention that when you get on. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I've enjoyed spending time with you. If you have any questions for me, just holler via Twitter, email, anything. Thanks so much, and I'll turn it over to Anna.
All right. Thank you so much, Tyra. That was a really great, informative webinar, and we really appreciate your time. And yes, our the webinar has been recorded, so you guys will all get an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. Also, I wanted to share that Tyra will be speaking at our annual Connect Marketplace show, August 25th through 27th in Grapevine, Texas. She'll also be at Connect Faith and Connect Florida in Orlando. That's October 25th through 27th. And for more information, you can reach out to Michael Vada, and his email is there on the screen as well. And I'll put it in the comments too. So if you guys have any questions about our marketplace shows, you can reach out to him. We're really excited, of course, to have Tyra speaking there as well. And so, yeah, thank you so much for attending the session. You guys can check out all of our websites listed here on your screen for more information about upcoming webinars. And again, here is Haley's email. If you have questions about getting your certificate of attendance, she'll be able to help you out. She's currently out of the office, but we'll be back on Monday. So just send her an email if you have questions, and she'll get back to you as soon as possible. And our next webinar is July 20th at 2 p.m. And we'll have Austin Johnston. He is another Connect Marketplace speaker, and he'll be presenting on AV. Hollywood producer shares his secrets for innovative and impeccable AV at events. And that is sponsored by Visit Lex in Kentucky. And here, last but not least, is our social account. So if you guys are interested in connecting with us on social, we love to hear your feedback and your thoughts on everything that we're doing here at Connect. So just take a few moments maybe to follow us, and we really appreciate it. So yeah, thanks again for attending, and we'll hope that you'll join us for our July webinar on July 20th. And don't hesitate to send any questions to Haley or to Michael Vada about Marketplace. And thank you guys all for joining us, and hope you all have a wonderful day.